Ina koutou, tina koutou, tina koutou katoa. No mai, haere mai, welcome to this session of the Early Childhood Seminar Series. We'll begin our time together with a karakia. Me e nui tātou, kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa pounamu te moana. Hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai. Tātou I a tātou katoa. Haumi e, hui e, taiki e. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation by Karen Mackay and Associate Professor Tara McLaughlin from Massey University. Supporting children's developing social emotional competence in the early years is an area we know is of interest to our Early Childhood Seminar Series audience, and we are delighted to have Tara back with us to build on the research and ideas she shared in a previous seminar in 2019. If you have any questions arise for you during the presentation that you would like to ask the presenters, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and they will respond to them at the end of their presentation. You can also use the chat function throughout the presentation to connect with each other and the panelists. After the seminar, a recording will be available on our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel. I will now pass over to Dr. Justine O'Hara-Gregan to welcome and introduce Karen Mackay and Associate Professor McLaughlin.
Kia ora, Louise. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I am delighted to introduce and welcome our speakers for today, Karen Mackay and Associate Professor Tara McLaughlin from the Institute of Education at Te Kununa or Purihurua, Massey University. Karen Mackay is a professional clinician for early years education at Massey University, and prior to this, she held a range of teaching and leadership roles across a wide range of early childhood services. Her interests include assessment and planning, literacy, mathematics, social and emotional competence, and leadership. And Karen was the pedagogical leader for the Teacher-led Innovation Fund project, Unpacking a Puzzle of Practice. Tara McLaughlin is an associate professor in the Institute of Education at Massey University, and Tara is an experienced teacher, teacher educator, and researcher in inclusive early learning settings in the United States and in New Zealand. A key aspect of Tara's work focuses on social emotional learning and teaching, emphasising the role of professional learning supports and resources in enhancing the confidence and competence of whānau, kaiako, and leaders in helping children to develop and flourish. As Louise mentioned, Tara presented for us at the Early Childhood Seminar Series in 2019, and we're absolutely delighted to have her back today with Karen to share further about culturally responsive, intentional, and data-informed approaches to supporting children's social emotional competence. As Karen and Tara share with us today, please do use that Q&A function for any questions that arise, and I'll facilitate asking those at the end of the presentation. So no mai, haere mai, Karen and Tara, we're absolutely delighted to have you with us today. Over to you.
Kia ora, Justine and Louise. Ngā mihi nui for having Tara and myself this evening. It's exciting to be part of the Early Childhood Seminar Series. And thanks also to all of you who are joining us online. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend this time with us. So to start us off this evening, we wanted to focus on the importance of reflective practice in relation to social emotional competence. When we engage in reflective practice as kaiako, we place a critical lens on our teaching, meaning we become more aware of any potential bias or assumptions that we have about social emotional competence. So our bias and assumptions often come from our previous experiences, including the ways of being and doing as we were growing up, also our value system and kind of any other experiences that we've had along the way. So when we engage in reflective practice, it really causes us to call into question our those values and think, okay, so what is research telling us, and how can we dig deeper into those values and beliefs and unpack them and ensure that our practice then becomes research informed and leads us to come to more inclusive solutions focused practice with our tamariki and whānau. So to hear more about this, I'm just going to pass over to Tara.
Yeah. Kia ora tātou, everyone. It is just a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for taking the time at the end of what I know has been a busy day, and for some of you is still ongoing, a busy day to join us, or for those of you who are listening at a later time, thank you for taking the time to come and listen and think more about social emotional competence and how we support that in young children. As Karen mentioned, really taking that reflective lens to this work, we believe is critically important. As everyone knows, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So if I get weirdly excited, just get excited with me, and we'll see how we go. So what we're going to do is I'm going to kick us off with a quick look at what we mean by children's social emotional competence. I find this is always useful just to get us on the same page. I'm also going to talk us through the update on the increasing range of national frameworks, programs, and resources that are now out there and available for kaiako and leaders to think about as they're trying to support children's social emotional competence, and some of the considerations that people might want to take into account when making decisions about choosing and selecting these. I'll then kick it back over to Karen, who's going to talk us through the findings from that Teacher-Led Innovation Fund project that she led, focused on promoting children's social emotional competence, and she'll be talking through some of her key reflections as a leader in guiding that kind of work. So it's really exciting, and let's get started. So if you've ever been to one of my presentations before on social emotional competence, you have probably seen this definition. I always just like to open up with a working definition of social emotional competence because it's not clearly one thing. Social emotional competence is quite a complex set of skills, knowledge, attitudes that children learn to use in culturally and socially appropriate ways in their everyday situations. And this includes the ability to form close relationships and form close and secure relationships and friendships with both adults and peers, engage in positive and mutually beneficial social interactions, as well as solve their interpersonal conflicts, experience, express, and regulate their emotions, and use pro-social and positive learning behaviors appropriate for their situations or setting expectations. And so there's a lot going on when we think about supporting children's social emotional competence. It's a sort of multifaceted kind of skill set. When children have these capabilities, they're really well positioned to do that sort of exploring of their environment. They're playing, they're learning, engaging with family, community. And they start to develop that sense of competence and confidence in themselves. They have this positive self-identity and self-esteem, and they're able to adapt to new situations and overcome challenges. And so this is a really critical skill set that sets children up for all other aspects of life, learning, and well-being. So I always kind of describe a couple of notes on social emotional competence because I think these are important. Very often we like to think of social emotional competence, or sometimes social emotional competence gets put in the sort of realm of kind of a personality trait, and it's not that at all. It is very much in sort of a skill, knowledge, attitude set that children can learn over time. So it's not something that they have or don't have, something that is sort of static within them. It's something that they're constantly learning, gaining, and figuring out how to use. And that is learned over time in the context of really good, secure, and responsive relationships with guidance and support, opportunities to practice, and some intentional teaching. So really giving children quite specific information around the skills that support them to do well. Of course, these skills, the attitudes, the knowledge, it'll look different and be enacted in different ways across different cultures, contexts, and children. And we need to be really cognizant of that. As Karen mentioned, bringing a reflective lens helps us consider what are some of the beliefs that we have about how this might look or should be, and how might that be different for different children and families, for different contexts. And so working through those beliefs and how this skill set can be applied very differently depending on the context. It's also important to remember that social emotional competence in young children, and quite honestly, even throughout the lifespan adults, is going to fluctuate across different situations across the day and over the life course based on our ever-changing situations. And so when a child might be able to sort of bring sort of skills and competencies to one environment, they may not bring the same skills and competencies to another environment where they feel less secure, or it has new elements that they're unfamiliar with. And so that idea that, well, I've seen them do this before may not always apply across contexts. And so building up that repertoire, building up those skills, giving them experience and support helps them strengthen that over time. One of the reasons I think people are always drawn to social emotional competence is because what happens when children are learning social emotional competence or are still struggling to gain some of the skills and knowledge that support them in this realm. And that is what we might consider challenging behavior. The thing about challenging behavior that's important to remember is that challenging behavior is often challenging for the adults in the environment, not necessarily the children. Sometimes the behaviors that they're using are working quite well for them in order to get attention, in order to get a toy, in order to access the resource that they were looking for. And so when we think about challenging behavior, it's really important to think that sometimes it's how it challenges us rather than it being necessarily a problem for the child. And we can think about two types of challenging behaviors: age-expected challenging behaviors and persistent challenging behaviors. Age-expected challenging behaviors are the things that we expect of young children as they're learning to navigate their social worlds and gain these skills. We know that children are going to cry when they're upset or tired. They're occasionally going to hit or push as they're figuring out the social boundaries. They might grab a toy or do something along those lines. These are the kind of behaviors that decrease over time in intensity and duration as they're gaining the skills of social emotional competence. And so while we might find them particularly challenging, it's just something we would expect. And with positive guidance, support, that intentional teaching, we would expect children to change over time. Persistent challenging behaviors are that kind of repeated pattern of behavior that does start to interfere with children's learning or their social relations, that now other children aren't really wanting to play with them, or because they're struggling with something, they're not actually getting to have as many learning experiences as they might otherwise have. And when children have persistent challenging behavior, we do need to look and work with our team and leaders to access more resourcing and support to ensure that these children are gaining the competencies and the skills of social emotional competence and aren't missing out on important learning opportunities. But for our purposes today, regardless of whether it's age expected or persistent challenging behavior, it's important to take a positive frame. Instead of thinking about it as a challenge, instead of thinking about it as a problem, think about it in a positive way in terms of what the child is seeking and needing from us. And so if we can reframe kind of that way we might describe a child's behavior in a positive light, we kind of see the pathway to how we might help them. And so instead of thinking about a child as an attention seeker, we might reframe that as a child who's a connection seeker. Instead of thinking about a child who's giving you a hard time, we could reframe that as having a hard time and needs your support. Instead of saying, oh, that's a real defiant child, focusing on what that child is someone who's focusing on what they want to do right now and has really good focus. Instead of saying a child's misbehaving, we might think of a child as needing some important skills that we can teach them. Instead of saying a child is lacking control, we might think about that child as being very expressive and excited about the things that draw their attention. And this reframing can just help us move from that, oh, there's something going on with the child, to, oh, this is part of my role as a teacher. Now, we all do this and we want to do this, but we also have to recognize that, in our busy days, it can be difficult sometimes. And so just bringing this reminder to ourselves, to our practice, can be really important. And, working as a team to bring that positive lens can make a big difference as well. So what does all this background mean for teachers and leaders? And these are things that I know you guys know and are already doing. The way that you think about and interact with children matters, bringing that positive framing. Doing the work of actively teaching children social emotional skills. Given the number of people who are attending this session, listening to this session, I know this is stuff that you're already doing and looking to strengthen and grow. Creating that setting and context that presents opportunities and motivates children to use these skills, and really recognizing when they're doing a great job and rewarding them through our attention, our praise, opportunities to, engage in the things that matter to them. It is important to remember that some children will pick up these skills easily, while others will not, and they may need more support. So for those children who are having a harder time grasping some of these skills, providing that extra support. And it's something I know everybody knows, when I'm talking about these are skills that we use in social context. So the most meaningful place to support them, to teach them, to help children practice them is in our everyday interactions, routines, meaningful activities, and play. And that just helps set us up for, developmentally appropriate practice. So with this idea that this is stuff that you're already probably doing, which is, why you're here, to kind of just continue to grow and strengthen that. What are some of the things, some of the resources that you can use to help you grow and strengthen your practice in this area? And it's interesting because the expanse of things has changed quite a bit since the last time I joined the seminar series. And so the first resource that you can turn to is Tafariki. Tafariki is obviously our curriculum. It is our guide. It gives us guidance about what's important for children to learn. Now, it is common for people to sort of associate social emotional competence with the well-being and belonging strand, but I've made an effort to sort of star some of the learning outcomes that I think are most related to social emotional competence, though I would argue social emotional competence is actually integrated throughout all of them in line with our holistic curriculum. But you can see that social emotional competence and the skills and knowledge and attitudes that go with that are in well-being, they're in belonging, they're in contribution, they're in communication, and they're in exploration. So thinking about this skill set as working across the curriculum and turning to the curriculum for the types of skills that are important to support children with. However, Tafariki is, as it's intended to be, a guide around children's learning. It focuses on the things that are important for children to learn. While it does offer guidance and advice around the teaching practices that can support children's learning, it's not as explicit with these. And so very often people do need to turn to other sources to get ideas and sort of things that might matter in terms of teaching these areas in supportive ways. And so that's when I think about the different frameworks, programs, and practices that are out there. And so quick definition of what I mean by frameworks, programs, and practices. By the term frameworks, I'm really referring to sort of written descriptions or illustrated figures that describe the relationships among key areas of teaching and learning. And these figures and kind of models very often serve as a roadmap for thinking about the elements of effective practice. Then there'll be a range of programs out there, and programs provide specifically recommended activities, materials, and practices to support children's learning. Programs may be very fixed in their guidance and expectations about how much you do something or when you do something, or they might be a bit more flexible, but still expect a certain amount of make sure you do this, use these resources, use these activities. Then there's a focus on practices, and a focus on practices is really trying to sort of describe the actions or elements of recommended teaching strategies that support children's learning that can be applied in flexible ways. So instead of having, if from a program perspective, Tucker the turtle in the Incredible Years program is something that helps you teach children about calming down, a practice might be have a strategy that children can use to calm themselves down. So it just kind of, the practice removes the intent from any specific materials or program. Now, full disclosure, I happen to be a frameworks and practices kind of person more than I am a programs person, but programs do have their place and can provide a lot of useful guidance and material for teachers to draw from. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to take you through the whirlwind tour of the frameworks, programs, and practice guides that are out there, just to kind of see the range that's available to you, particularly in relation to supporting children's social emotional learning. So the first is Te Whare Tapa Whā, the Health and Wellbeing Model by Sir Mason Drury. And this is a Te Ao Māori health model that was really designed to identify the core elements of what matters when thinking about health and well-being. And what's notable about this model and its application to social emotional competence is both the mental and emotional well-being, the social well-being, the physical well-being, and the spiritual well-being. As a model, it doesn't have any specific practices associated with it or any programs, but it gives us that idea of the elements that matter. Another model that you may or may not be familiar with is Te Tuapapa o He Pikarua, which is the learning support practice framework from the Ministry of Education. And this is a model that identifies basically how we might think about the intensity or focus of different types of support that we're providing to all of our learners. Thinking about things that are sort of universal and applicable across all learners in all environments. Thinking about things that are more targeted, that might increase in intensity for a certain child or take a particular focus. And thinking about things that are more tailored, really working on sort of an individualized learning support plan kind of area. And again, this doesn't have any particular practices associated with it, but it's a way to think about how we might vary the intensity of the supports that we're providing to children. So now I'm going to move off frameworks and into some of the programs that are out there. I expect everybody's familiar with the Incredible Years program or has heard about it. It's been I guess it was adopted by the ministry more than 10 years ago, I believe now, and has been rolled out with teachers in primary school as well as early childhood. This is both a framework in terms of how it organizes sets of practices, as well as a program that comes with set materials and recommendations on things to do with children. And it really is focused on positive behavior support. The ministry has also trialed recently the ALERT program, which is a program developed to teach children how alert they feel and regulate their bodies towards attending and having positive behaviors to support their learning. And it's a program really focused on self-regulation and sensory awareness skills. And it happens to use the analogy of how's your engine running and supporting children to think about their body as an engine and making decisions about how it's going to sort of either bring their energy levels up or energy and alert levels down. Then there's the Engage program. The Engage program involves playing a selection of familiar games with children to support self-regulation, self-control, and it takes a focus on attentional, behavioral, cognitive, and emotional self-regulation and control. And I think the games that are played are everyday games that you're probably playing already, but the program provides a little bit of guidance about how often, when, which games support what areas of self-regulation, and just some recommendations depending on what settings need. Then there's the Pause, Breathe, Smile program. This is a mindfulness program that started in primary schools, but has also been extended to support early childhood. And they've got some core practices around mindful breathing, emotional literacy, mindful movements. They've organized around Te Whare Tapa Whā, mindful eating, gratitude, kindness, and resiliency. And because of its connections with primary school, it does have some lessons as such, but are then more flexibly applied when used in early childhood. Next, there's the Kind Hearts program, and this is a program from a New Zealand-based trust that is focused on building a strong culture of kindness alongside the local values of the community, and provide materials that just support settings, teachers, leaders to really celebrate and acknowledge kindness, and really foster children to want to engage in kind behaviors and actions. So quite a range of programs out there covering quite a range of things. So now I'm kind of moving into some of the resources that are out there that we might think about as frameworks and practices. He Māpuna Te Tamaiti obviously has been put out by the ministry around supporting children's social emotional competence. It provides a framework of core areas as well as practices and knowledge for teachers to enact those practices with that practice reflection list. You may or may not have heard of Hikairo schema, which was developed by McFarland's and colleagues around culture responsive teaching and learning. And same thing, they've got a framework of core areas of culturally responsive practice, and then they have lists of practices that kind of connect with each of those. So again, sort of a framework and practice. One that you may have heard about, but probably haven't had the chance to see yet is Kōwhiti Whakapai, which is a new resource coming from the Ministry of Education. It will be out later this year. And first off the block is the social emotional aspect of the resource, and it's going to provide information about different practices that kaiako might engage in order to support children's learning progress, as well as some information around what learning progress for children's social emotional might look like over time. And it deals with the areas of connected relationships and caring for others, emotional awareness, regulation, and spiritual connectedness, agency and adaptability, and social inclusion and action. So that was fast. And that was a range of things that are out there for kaiako and leaders to choose from. And so you might be wondering, well, which one is the right one? What is the framework, the program, or the resource that we should be picking? And I think it's really important to point out that there is no right one. Each framework or program is going to be influenced by its origin story. Who was the developer? What was the original intent of its development? How has that sort of evolved over time, as well as its area of focus? Is it trying to cover a range of things in social emotional, or is it honing in on a specific aspect? So there is no right one. We are doing some work right now to look at some comparisons across the different areas and setups of the frameworks and programs out there. And very often there really is more in common in terms of focus, principles, and practices that matter than there are differences, except for the ones that take quite different lens, like the kindness one versus self-control focus. But in general, the things that matter have more in common across. And so we recommend taking an eclectic approach that draws from these various options to inform the teaching and learning practices in your setting. Always starting with Te Whāriki as the base, thinking about what is evidence-informed, meaning what is likely to be effective based on the research available, what is appropriate in your local context, and what is effective with children in your setting. And so kind of working through those things in order to make decisions. So you might be wondering, given some of those programs particularly have different areas of focus, what matters in terms of children's social emotional competence? And my colleague Linda Clark and I recently worked with the Ministry of Education around developing a whānau guide for the area of social emotional learning. And Linda and I were asked to identify, if you will, our top 5, but we did 6, messages on what's important in terms of social emotional teaching and learning that we wanted to share with whānau. And we would share these same messages with kaiako. And that is really to make sure we're helping children feel good about who they are, talking about feelings, reassuring children that it's okay not to feel okay, establishing consistent routines and expectations, playing games together, and show kindness, compassion, and gratitude. You will find learning outcomes and aspects of Te Whāriki that align with all of those things. You will also see elements of those things embedded within the different programs or resources, such as He Māpuna Te Tamaiti or Kōwhiti Whakapai. And so going to the multiple resources, accessing a range of programs may be helpful to really make sure we're covering the range of things that matter. So what might be a reasonable process to go through in order to do that eclectic look? And so Karen and I talked about how we might frame up some of the key things that matter in terms of trying to bring your team and your own practice through this process. And we identified sort of 4 action steps. And these 4 action steps really aren't anything revolutionary. They're just sort of a way to frame how we go about things. And you can think about them as a continual process of reflection and action to unpack and grow what we believe, know, and do. And these 4 action steps are embedded within the context of internal evaluation when we do it as a team or as a center, professional growth cycle, and teacher inquiry when we're doing it, kind of ourselves as individual kaiako, or through local curriculum design. So these aren't revolutionary concepts. They just give us a way to frame how we might approach looking at key areas of learning. And our action steps are take a closer look at the area of learning and teaching. What is it? What matters for children? What matters for teachers? And what do we know and believe about this? Then personalize the sort of knowledge that's out there in the evidence base and your understanding of beliefs to really develop local curriculum. What matters in our community? What are the practices we're already using? What are the practices we want to be using? And then use a culture responsive, intentional, and data-informed approach to that teaching and learning in partnership with families. And when we say data-informed approach, we're really just talking about using a range of assessment and evaluation tools to help guide your reflection and thinking as part of being a reflective practitioner, but also engaging in intentional planning, as well as a consideration always starting from who's this child and family and what matters for them. And then finally, that need to provide ongoing PLD and supports for teachers. And while it's great to access external PLD from time to time, how do we keep that going? What is our internal PLD process that supports us to sort of refresh and rejuvenate our focus on this in an ongoing way? And that's where leadership is particularly key. So I'm going to pass over to Karen now, who's actually going to frame up a little bit of how they've approached the TLIF using these 4 steps. Not that everybody should follow what we've done in the TLIF project, but rather here's an example of these 4 steps in action. So Karen, over to you.
Sort of, Tara. So as Tara mentioned, we're just going to explore these action steps through the context of our TLIF project. So in 2018, while I was a leader at Best Up Palmerston North, we applied for and won a teacher-led innovation. So this led us to exploring and unpacking kind of exploring what are the most effective teaching practices in order to support children's social emotional competence. So what we did is we started to unpack this and started to think about, well, what's going to be our first step? And that's what led us to the research, looking at the research. So what you'll see there is a link to our full report if you want to access that. But I'm just going to give a brief overview for you this evening. Thanks, Tara. First of all, really want to acknowledge the amazing tamariki, whānau, kaiako leaders and critical friends that supported us during this process. It was a huge project, and as you can see from the dates, it took us a good couple of years with COVID in between, so there was lots happening during that time. I'll give you a bit of a context of the setting. So Best Start Palmerston North at the time that we began the project had a license of 211. And we had a team of 34 kaiako, both unqualified and qualified, and we involved everyone in the project. So it was quite a big project, as you can imagine. It was a centre-wide internal evaluation, if you look at it from that context. Thanks, Tara. So here you can see the actions, the first action step that Tara's explored earlier. So at this point, we were taking a closer look. And in order for us to do that, we first looked at Te Whāriki. Like Tara highlighted, that's the most important place for everyone to start. And so that's what we looked at first. What is Te Whāriki telling us? Have we explored it in an in-depth way, because at that time Te Whāriki had only just been revised, so that it was revised in 2017 and we started our project in 2018. And when we were looking at what was out there, what was important to us was that we were thinking about social and emotional competence from a Te Ao Māori perspective. So that meant that we were quite drawn to Sir Mason Jury's Te Whare Tapawhā model. So that was key for us. And we also wanted to look at all the research that was available and start to unpack that a little bit further. The Incredible Years, as Tara mentioned, was out and had been out for quite a few years at that time. None of our teachers had actually had any in-depth training, although we had tapped into other colleagues and used different resources at different times. And of course, He Māpuna Te Tamaiti was not available at that time. So this just gives you a bit of a taste of where we kind of started. Thanks, Tara. And then from there, we started to personalize the knowledge. So we drew together all the research, and there's a wide range of examples and knowledge and skills that we needed to learn and upskill ourselves in. And so we were thinking, now, where do you start? Because that's the trickiest thing, isn't it? Where do you start? There's so much information available, and how do you kind of go through it and think about what is the most meaningful for us in our place. So that's where we drew on Te Whare Tapawhā. We thought, well, that's what's meaningful for our community at this time, to be thinking from a Te Ao Māori perspective. So that's where we decided, well, everything that we do and everything that we create, including our teacher reflection practice tool and our child assessment tool, needs to be framed by the model Te Whare Tapawhā. So that's kind of how we started to draw things in and started to refine our thinking to guide our practice and to guide our internal evaluation at this point. Thanks, Tara. So the other model that we did draw on was the inquiry model. So it was something that our teaching team had been using already. So it was something that was familiar. So it meant that we didn't actually have to learn these ways of being and doing. We were already thinking about observing each other's practice. We were already thinking about our practices. We were engaging in reflection, and then from there we were planning and applying new practices. So we wanted to continue on that journey. So this was the model that we used. And then what we did, as we learned more, we started to refine our practice, and we started to develop more in-depth observation. And this is where we started to bring through video and started to use video as a tool to do this. And we also, as we went, we thought, well, it's really important that we use what is working well for us, and our assessment was something that was working really well. So we drew in our learning stories, and we thought, what are our learning stories telling us about social and emotional competence now? And then we can also look at that. That will help us to, our assessment and planning will help us to show that progression as we move through. And that's what ended up happening. And of course, whānau were a huge part of our project. So it was important that we shared information about the project, but also really involved whānau in a collaborative way. And one of the things that we looked at is that in terms of sharing what we were thinking about and the project as a whole, we found more formal ways of doing that was not really effective. So we focused on sharing kai with our whānau and getting together and generally chatting. And then we found that if we had resources that we were developing and exploring while we did that, that was an informal but more effective way to do this. Alongside that, we were connecting with our whānau on a daily basis to ensure that we were engaging these conversations about social and emotional competence and starting to talk about progression. Thanks, Tara. So as Tara mentioned, PLD is really essential. And what we did is we mostly wanted to engage and develop our own ways of extending our own and each other's practice. And so that's where we had the model of coming together. We did our observations, and then what we would do is we would meet with a head teacher or myself as the curriculum manager and start to unpack, well, what are we seeing through these observations, and what are your goals, what are you excited about, and what do you want to learn more about? And those were the kind of conversations that we had, and that's what led us through our professional development and learning. And also alongside that, we looked at coaching as a model and started to unpack that in a more in-depth way. And that got us as leaders starting to question, okay, so how are we going to best support the teachers that we're meeting with? How are we going to strengthen our coaching skills in this space? And so that led us to our own professional development as well as leaders. So it was pretty exciting. It was that ongoing of, oh, what are the researchers out there? Oh, what's each other doing? How can we learn from one another and create our own professional learning space, our own professional learning community? And along the way, we developed some amazing tools to support our tamariki whānau and ourselves, which was, it's a really exciting process. Thanks, Tara. So you can see, we just want to briefly give an overview of some of the findings of the project. And as you can see there, between the pre-data that we collected and the data that we collected at the end, there was quite a lot of growth. And we were really excited about this. And some of the examples of that growth were through our assessment practice. What we'd seen at the start when we looked at our learning stories, our planning, the different types of assessments that we gathered, we found that social and emotional learning wasn't really evident at all. And then there was a huge shift towards the end that it was really, really visible. And as it became more visible, whānau started to share more with us, and I suppose their feedback or their contributions became more specific about their child's learning. So that was the exciting phase, is the more confident we became through our assessment practices, the more whānau actually contributed as well. So their engagement and their communication really increased. And we also, like I said previously, had more supports. We created our own resources, which was pretty exciting as well. And one example of that is social stories. So I know Vicky Giffis, she is one of our colleagues as well, and she's just recently published an article in our Early Education magazine. So if you want to learn more about social stories, you can delve into that article, which is pretty exciting. And the ways that we use social stories was to think about what was happening for the child. And like I said, in collaboration with whānau, we would talk about areas that we wanted to support the child in, or whānau would talk to us about ways that they'd like us to support their child. And then we develop a social story around that. So one example of that is around, say, a child developing their confidence to engage with other children. And we create a story about ways that the child could do that. And we found it was really rich and valuable tool to use. And with this one example I'm thinking of, the whānau actually would have the social story in the car every morning, and the child would access it on the way to the centre. So it was pretty powerful for both Tamaiti and whānau and us as kaiako. And also along the way, kaiako's confidence really increased. And so they were finding that they were a lot calmer when they were dealing with situations. So Tara mentioned earlier that our own, as kaiako, our own social emotional competence is really important, that we're focusing on that. And the research is showing, highlighting that more and more, that the more socially, emotionally competent we are as kaiako, the more effective we are. And also it's really good for our own well-being and decreases the amount of burnout that happens when we are working comfortably and confidently in that space. Thanks, Tara. All right, so here within the when we zoomed in on the shifts that we'd been noticing, we focused in on the teaching about emotions. So when we first started, we noticed that the range of emotions that children understood or could talk about were more around the angry, sad and happy. So that was kind of the crux of it. So we thought, oh gosh, how are we going to explore or extend their knowledge in this space? And that's where we came up with a range of tools that we could use with Tamaiti. So that we used a lot of visual tools to support them, and a lot of games, like Tara had mentioned earlier, and that was the way that we kind of supported children to grow their understanding of a variety of emotions. And whānau used a lot of these tools at home as well. Thanks, Tara. And from a Te Ao Māori perspective, like I mentioned, we were quite intentional about focusing on social and emotional competence from a Te Ao Māori perspective. So our reflection tool that we created for ourselves as teachers to refer to constantly actually got us thinking at a deeper level about how we could extend children's social and emotional competence from a Te Ao Māori perspective. So we zoomed in on ngā atua and thought about how we could make emotions feel a little bit more tangible for children, so that they could understand the feelings or the physical ways their bodies were changing through different emotions. So an example of this is when thinking about Rongoku, the atua of volcanoes. We used to talk with children about how they could feel that bubbling up in their puku, and how when they're feeling frustrated, sometimes it feels like it's bubbling and sometimes it feels like they're going to explode. And that was a way for them to understand those emotions. And then we talked with them about tawhiri and how if we took deep breaths, that would help calm that volcano that was starting to erupt in our puku. The key that we learned through the project, the key was though that we needed to actually practice or talk about these strategies when children were really calm, when they're in that calm space, because they wouldn't be able to access those skills and strategies when they're in the heat of the moment. So that's why we often would practice when they were really, really calm. And we saw great shifts as a result. Fantastic, Tara. Thank you. So a key part that we mentioned before is the role of a leader in a project. And in our case, it wasn't just one leader, there were a team of leaders, and I can't thank these amazing people enough for the ways that they worked alongside me to support the rest of the team. But I think the key thing to identify at this point is a leader's role is to really grow a teacher's professional capability. And there's a range of research out there of ways to do that. And there's a range of models of PLD to inform us of what to do or how to do this. But what we need to think about is what's going to work within our context at that time for the teachers. We need to know the teachers that we're working with really well and know what their capabilities are already, so we can celebrate those and actually build on those capabilities and think about the professional learning that will support them to grow even further. And I think having a collective vision is really, really key at this point. And where our vision was at the time was that we knew that it was really important for our community that we strengthen children's social and emotional competence. And we also knew, in terms of a vision, that it was really important that we do this from a Te Ao Māori perspective. Thanks, Tara. Oh, and I've done what I said I wouldn't do, and I've covered the next PowerPoint. Apologies for that. All right, so talking about the clear vision is key, but also I think from a leading as a non-Māori leader, that can be, a new and really complex space to be moving into. And so what I had to think about was how I was communicating with our Māori whānau and making sure that anything that we did was respectful, that we kind of checked in with them regularly, that we created resources in an environment that was authentic from a Te Ao Māori perspective. And the only way that we could do that was to, regularly connect with them and gain their feedback, gain their perspectives. And that's what we tried to do on a regular basis. Other reflections. Looking back on the project, I think that the biggest thing that stood out was the power of the video observations that we did. But as we started to introduce that, as many of you have probably found when you're introducing video, part of that self-reflective process is that you have to kind of have a trusting environment to start with. And the way that we did that is we talked about kind of the unofficial protocols. And that was where what we decided to do as a team is that the teachers would actually look at their video by themselves so that they could feel comfortable, because no one really likes listening to themselves on a recording or looking at themselves. So the teachers did that by themselves, and the leader who was going to be working with them watched it by themselves, took notes, and then what we did is we came together, and the conversation was so rich because I think we got past that uncomfortable phase, and it meant that, the way that we used video was really powerful because it was a stepping stone to that next step. And the other thing that cropped up for us was authentic video. And I don't know if many of you have had conversations around this, but we questioned, so what's an authentic video? Is it that you've prepared things that you want to do based on your inquiry? You might have a resource that you wanted to try, or a specific teaching strategy that you wanted to try. So you planned to explore that. And then we thought, well, was that authentic? Or is it better that you just have a spontaneous video taken of your practice? And what we decided in the end was the importance of having both. So you need both that spontaneous as well as that plan. And then from there, It's creating that time and that space for professional dialogue. And I know that we don't have a lot of time in early childhood. There's not a lot of time and space for those conversations, but it's making that time, but also catching that moment when you can have an in-depth but really brief conversation. And as I mentioned earlier, the coaching strategies is really key. It's when you're actually celebrating the strengths that the teacher already has and celebrating what they do well, but also bringing your expertise as a leader, because we all, like the teacher has expertise and the leader has expertise, and coming together to a shared understanding, as well as identifying those clear next steps, like how are we going to support each other's growth in this space, because often I would learn as much as the teacher would learn. So yeah, it was really exciting time, and just such a privilege to be able to share some of these reflections with you today. Thanks, Tara. So lastly, as I previously mentioned, I think one of the most important roles a leader can take is to recognise and engage the potential that others have. So I'll just pass over to Tara to finish off and draw everything together.
Well, as always, despite our best efforts to go quickly, Karen, you and I just always take a long time. So thank you, everyone, for engaging with us, listening to the sort of pre-information context, what's out there, and then the story of the TLIF as it was done by the team at the Best Start. And what we just really hope you can take away from this is, through the example, think about how you might work through those 4 action steps, recognizing that there's lots of different processes for which they might apply within. And access some of the resources that are out there. We always recommend starting with the whānau, He Māpuna, Te Tamaiti, and Kōwhiti Whakapai when it becomes available. Look at those different programs, pull what works in your setting, and be comfortable working eclectically. Create the tools and resources that support you and your teams to do the reflection on both your own practice and child learning. As Karen's talked about, that in-house PLD and support systems that leaders develop can be so critical to the success of this focus over time. And we always recommend start small and grow over time, which is how, she's describing the end of the project, we started small and grew the focus over time. So just a very big ngā nui for your time, for your interest. And if you'd like to learn more, you can check out our work at the Massey Early Years Research Lab website. So I believe, Justine, I stopped sharing now. Is that correct?
Would be great. And thank you so much, both of you, Karen and Tara. We are going to be a little bit tight on time for questions, but you've given us all so much to think about, and I'm hoping that, if nothing else, that people are going to go away inspired by hearing about all the wonderful resources that are available out there, and also the project that you shared about, Karen, that will actually inspire centres to get together and really start to think about doing some inquiry of their own around what this learning that you've shared tonight means for them. One thing that has kind of come through, I'm just trying to pull a thread through from some of the questions that we've got in the Q&A. And I think it is really around, and it's something that you've highlighted tonight, is around that central role of the teacher and leaders in early childhood settings. One of the questions was, that you could see the findings in data-based practices focused more on teachers' practices, teacher learning, and teach confidence rather than child-based data and growth. And maybe you could just talk a little bit more about why you've really focused in on teachers.
Ultimately, we come from the perspective that it's the things that we're doing that create the space to enable children to thrive and flourish, whether that be setting up our environment, whether that be the way we're having relationships with them and getting to know them, or adding those sort of intentional teaching practices, whether that be planned or spontaneous kinds of practices that help children. And so while it is important to have information on on children's learning and on children's progress, we kind of take the view that we really need to know what we're doing, then look at what's happening for children, and then use that to adjust what we're doing. But if we don't know what we're doing, what we're offering, what we're providing, you're kind of taking information about children's learning without the real context that's critically important to their well-being and success. And so that is our focus. So the resource that's coming from the ministry, Ko Whiti Whakapai, takes that lens of a look at practice before a look at children's progress, and then a relook at practice. And so we're really excited about that framework coming out because it does exactly that. It takes that perspective. Karen, did you want to add to that?
I think that you explained it really well, Tara, and I think what we did is along the way we did utilize like our assessment practices to show and highlight the ways that tamariki were progressing, but like you said, that would draw us back into, okay, as a result, what are we as kaiako going to do next? We've seen this progression. What could we do next to continue to support them and extend their knowledge from a social and emotional competence lens?
And one of the things Karen mentioned that I think is really important, as kaiako were more specific with what they were doing and more confident in sharing that enabled families to be more specific and confident. And it sort of transitioned the information sharing from what, it can be the niceties to the practicalities of what was happening for children and the supports that both kaiako and whānau could be providing, which was really cool. Some of the examples of that in their project were awesome to see.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree that when we can articulate what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it, it sort of brings those conversations to the surface rather than people making assumptions about things. And I really did like, I think it was you, Karen, that sort of emphasized that our own, and that you found that the kayako's own social emotional competence was so important, and that they were bringing that. And I think that responds to one of the questions that somebody raised around that notion that it's not just about then children self-regulating, but actually our awareness as kaiako is how are we able to co-regulate with children, and we have to be socially emotionally competent ourselves in order to be able to do that. There are so many things that we could continue to talk about.
We're so naughty, we're sorry.
No, you are not naughty at all, but people can go back and they can revisit, and I certainly will be going back and looking at those lists of resources that you've shared. And certainly in my own teaching, I'll be really encouraging my students again to be going back and really looking at what is their image that they hold of the child, and how are we framing up the behavior that we're seeing. And we tend to put a lot of things into the challenging behavior basket and put a lot of focus on that rather than actually thinking, but what's working really well, and seeing the child's that they are all good inside, and they're all doing the best they can with the strategies and knowledge that they have at the time. So thank you both so much. Ngā mihi nui kia korua. Thank you for your sharing tonight, for your advocacy for children and for supporting their social and emotional learning. As I said before, your sharing today is giving us all a great deal to think about, to discuss, and also to go back and put into action. So ngā mihi nui kia korua. I'm going to hand back now to Louise to close our webinar. Kia ora, Louise.
Kia ora, Justine, and thank you, Karen and Tara, for your presentation today. Your discussion has affirmed how we can take a research-informed and intentional approach to supporting children's developing social and emotional competence in the early years. We hope that this seminar will act as a catalyst for our audience to engage in ongoing conversations about and reflection on their own pedagogy and practice in relation to this important topic. Ngā mihi nui kia korua. We are very appreciative of your time and sharing of your expertise. To our Early Childhood Seminar Series audience, if you wish to share or revisit this presentation, please check out our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel. The recording of the seminar will be available in a couple of days, and we look forward to seeing you all back for our next seminar in August. So keep an eye on your inbox for the flyer and registration information. Thank you again for joining us today. We will now close with a karakia. Kia tau te rangi Māori o te rangi e tū iho nei, o papatua nuku I takoto nei, o te taiaho e awhi nei. Ki runga I a tātou, tihei Māori ora. May the peace of the sky above, of the earth below, of the all-embracing universe rest upon us all. Behold, it is life. Take good care, everyone. Ka kite anō.